Okay, so last time we started 7.1 and we started talking about array lists. And we went through last class, we went through probably like five different lessons or four different lessons. Just started speeding through, not speeding through like recklessly, but going through them and checking them off. Then we got here. We had a few minutes of class left, and my brain was a little fried because I had a long week. It was Friday, got to this point, and I just thought it was a good idea to stop there. So we'll pick back up where we left off, and we were at 7.1.3 Programming Challenge. And even as I was reading this last time, it was the first time I was seeing it, and I was just like, I don't know if I want to do this right now. So coming back to this, this is something that I want you guys to wrap your heads around as much as possible. Pay attention to this, and we're going to try and complete this together. It says, this programming challenge is based on the 2017 free response question. And we started this and actually ran it and looked at it, but I want to go back over it so that way we remember what we were doing. On the 2017 AP exam, this was kind of one of the questions. And it says, in this question, you are asked to write a constructor for a class called digits. What do we want to do? It takes an integer, and basically you pass a number in. Here's an argument. So let's say like 154. If you were to pass 154, it would then create an array list with the digits 1, 5, 4. The difference between an array and an array list is array list, you can add items onto it. It doesn't have to be a fixed like, hey, there's only 5 elements in this array. An array list allows you to add items to the end. It allows you to do a bunch of things as we're learning, but right now we're just starting with array lists. But they're similar to like lists that we dealt with in Python. So when we first introduced arrays, we compared them to Python lists, and now we can see what an array list is. It says, first, let's discuss how to break up a number into digits. So we did this last time, but it says, what happens if you divide an integer by 10? Let's look below here. Okay, you have main method, but you have this number 154. If I divide 154 by 10, if you plugged in your calculator, 154 divided by 10, what would your calculator tell you? 15.4. You just move the decimal plate over. Decimal plate? I say decimal plate. Decimal point over. I think I was thinking decimal place. And anyway. So with that, you move it over 1. But since this is an int, and number's an int, it will return an int. And in Java, it just cuts off whatever was left. So check this out. Rather than returning 15.4, it just returns 15. Okay? So with that, if you were to use the mod, right, what's left over if you mod 10, you would have 4 left over, which is interesting because if we are looking to take 154, but let's say we just want to look at one digit at a time, we could pull one digit at a time by just having this mod 10, right? Where mod 10 would take the very last number. So if you're dividing by 10, you would get 15. And then maybe if you wanted to get the 5, maybe we could find, you take the number, divide it by 10, and then you are then finding the modulus of that number. The mod 10 of 15 would be 5, and so on. Okay, so just something to think about. it says try changing it. So if I were to change this to just like 15, okay, it would say 15 divided by 10, even though it would be 1.5, it just cuts off everything after the decimal place. But if I were to find mod 10 of 15, it returns 5. Put it back to 154. Or if I said like 152, it would return that 2 at the end. Okay? So it's important going into what we're about to do. All right, it says we can use a while loop to print out each digit in reverse starting for 5, 1. Here's the pseudocode. So we'll write this. We'll write it up here. We'll try it. I'll say we'll still do 154, but it says while number is greater than 0, print out the last digit using mod, right? So you could say system.out.println. The last digit would be number mod 10, right? We determined that was true based off of the last example here, where when we had 152, mod 10 gave me 2. So 154 mod 10 should give me 4. That prints out the last digit. And then it says change the number to cut off the last digit. Okay, so then we can say number divided by equal 10. And what that does is it's the same as saying this, right? Number is assigned number divided by 10. But if you wanted to use the shortcut, you could just write it like this. Okay. Think that's what it's asking for. Let's see if that's right. And look at it. It prints out 4, 5, 1. These last 3 digits, right? If you were to comment out line 6 and 7, you get 4, 5, 1. So we pass in the number 154, okay? As long as 154 is greater than 0. Is 154 greater than 0? Yes. So we take the number, we mod 10, which cuts off the last digit, and we print it out. Then we divide the number by 10, which then gives me 15. Is 15 greater than 0? Yes. So we take 15 mod 10, which returns the 5. We then divide it by 10, which then only gives me 1. Is 1 greater than 0? Yes. 1 mod 10 is 1. And then we take 1 divided by 10. We get a number that is not going to continue to make this work. And we will then move on because we'll get 0, and 0 is not greater than 0. Okay, so now that we have this code right here, I'm literally going to copy this, line 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. I'm going to copy it because we're going to use it here in a second. It says, now let's write a constructor for the digits class that uses this loop and adds each found digit to the array list instead of printing it out. So as a reminder, right, we have this array list here, right? Array list, a private array list. You have to put inside the less than and greater than symbol. You write integer if you're dealing with integers. Make sure we're using the wrapper class, the integer with a capital I. Write the name of it, which is digit list. Okay. It says initialize digit list to an empty array list of integers. And looking back here, if you remember, we wrote new and then array list, the type, and then what was inside of it as well. So we are going to move down here. Well, I guess I can go in and just copy that. Whoops. So we used shopping list as an example right there, right? So I'll copy what we dealt with when we were talking about the shopping list. And I'll move down here. And in this line, I'll paste it. It's not a shopping list. This is called, we've determined that it's called digit list. Okay. Is a new array list, but it's not of type string. Right? It's going to be integer. Okay, that gives me an empty array list. Now it says use a while loop to add each digit in number to the array list. So if we scroll back here and we copy our while loop that we wrote in the last step right here, if I copy that while loop and bring it down here, remember we said while the number that's being passed in, because that's actually the same variable name, while the number is greater than 0, and this was printing it out. We don't want to print this out. And I'll go ahead and comment out this line, right? We don't want to print this out. We want to add this to the digit list, okay? And just a reminder, the way that we add items to lists is just by writing .add. In the same way with our shopping list, we said .add chocolate, .add bread, .add carrots. Speaking of shopping lists, I went to the grocery store yesterday and I got yelled at by some lady. There's like it's like a wet floor sign, right? Wet floor. When you see like a wet floor sign, doesn't mean like don't walk this way, right? It just means like it says caution, wet floor, right? I got yelled at, and eventually someone else, the manager, apologized to me. It was like, I don't know why she yelled at you, but I was just walking, and it said I turned a corner, and I saw that there. I was like, okay, so I just like then like moved past it. The lady, like I had my kids with me, and she like screamed at me. She's like, "There's an oil spill!" And yelling at me, "Don't walk over there." I said, "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I'm sorry." She looks at me and goes, "I made 3 announcements. 3." I was like, "I'm sorry. I didn't know. I apologize." And she's like, "When people start slipping and they start suing us, then we'll see who's not taking this seriously now." I'm like, I'm just trying to walk and get my groceries. Yelled at me. My kids were like, "What's going on?" I was like, "I have no idea." Eventually, the cashier and the manager apologized. Like, "I'm sorry. I don't know why she freaked out." Anyway, I was adding, while that happened, I was actually adding chocolate to my shopping cart. So that's what made me think of it. Some people are crazy. Digit list dot add. And what is it that I'm going to add? I'm going to add whatever the number is, mod 10. And then a semicolon at the end. Okay. So what that will do is the same thing we did above, where we will take the last digit in whatever number is being passed in. We'll later find out we're passing in the same number, 154, right? So if we add 154 into digits, right, digits will receive it right here as an int number. Okay, we created a empty list, and we're going to add 4, 5, and 1, just like we did up here, 4, 5, and 1. But rather than print them out, we're just going to add them to our array list. And after we add them to our array list, it doesn't want 451, it wants 154. So it says here, use collections.reverse digit list to reverse the digits. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to write collections.reverse digit list. Okay. Let me see if there's anything else. Let's run it. And let's see what we get. All right, it worked. So it prints out 154. So just to recap what we did, we have this. Oh, make sure this was already there for us, but we imported java.util.all, right? That wildcard. And then it says public class digits. We created our digit list, create a private array list. And then from there, our constructor, which we just finished writing, received from whenever anything's passed into digits, this is going to be a number, right? Then we're going to initialize this digit list. I guess we could have done it up there maybe, but we then have our while loop that loops through all the digits. And we're able to accomplish this with this while loop right here. Make sure to write mod 10. We can also probably take out line 17 there. I commented it out to begin with, but we can take out line 17. You don't need that. Okay. And then at the very end, we reverse the list, collections.reverse, and then digit list. And that's 714. We introduced array lists. We talked about how they're resizable. A list can, like, even yesterday I went to the grocery store and my wife said, hey, I forgot this. Can we add this to the list? And we added it. An array would not allow us to add items onto the end of the list. Okay. But that is 7.1 intro to array lists. We're going to move on and talk more about array lists in 7.2. And this says 7.2 array list methods. So this was fun. I remember going through this in APCSP, where we spent a decent amount of time talking about what we can do with lists. Eventually, I'm sure, what is this? 7.3, we traverse or loop through these array lists. But in 7.2, we're going to talk about some of their methods. Okay. So we'll talk about the size. We'll talk about adding. We already did this, but we'll talk more about it. We'll talk about where to add them, right? Different arguments you can pass in. Talk about removing items from array lists. Get and set methods that can be used. And we can compare arrays and array lists. So to the top, it says the following are the array list methods that you need to know for the APCSA exam. That's important, right? You really don't want to learn, well, I guess you want to learn beyond the scope of this class, yes, but you don't have to. And sometimes one thing that I struggle with sometimes too is like recognizing where we're currently at in the class, where we're going, and not using things that we didn't learn already, right? So it's like trying to teach math to a second grader, right? And imagine my second grade daughter comes in here right now and she needs help with her math homework. And if her teacher taught her one way, and then you try teaching her something entirely different, that might be a bit confusing. Or you might assume that she already knows something, And by assuming that she already knows something, you might be speaking above her and just not know where they're at. Or in my case, for example, I might just in going between different AP classes that we have, or just forgetting where we're at because I'm forgetful and forget things all the time. I might not realize that we didn't learn something yet and use it. So that's always been a difficult thing, is balancing that. So with that, when it comes to learning what's on the AP exam, you could go and do all these things and learn about all these other methods, teach yourself all these other array list methods that you could use that could save time, but they might not want you to use that on the APCSA exam. Actually, I mentioned to my APCSP students that on the create task, they don't want you to go above and beyond in terms of like creating this like super sophisticated project. They want you to follow the scope of the project and just make it work. Last year, some of you created really great projects for APCSP for your create task, but like they wanted it in a little bit simpler, right? And they wanted you to answer the questions very succinct, to the point. Don't want you rambling on about the answer. They don't want you writing thousands of lines of code. They want you writing something that works, right? So with that, let's just keep that in mind as we go through this. It says these are included on the APCSA Java quick reference sheet that you will receive during the exam. So you don't need to memorize them. That's good to know. But in anything you don't need to memorize, you need to know how to use it, right? If you have a periodic table in front of you, you don't know how to use it, then that's still a problem. It says the E, whenever you see E in the method headers, stand for the type of the element in the array list. This type E can be any object type. It says we will look at how these methods work below. So we'll be talking about size, add. I guess I could have just read through these before we started and not scrolled down. I could have just read this, but we'll learn how to return the number of elements in the list with the size method. We have how to, it says append or add on to, which we already learned. How to remove something. It says how to move any current objects at index or beyond to the right to a higher index, which would have been useful with, I believe, one of our array activities. It says returns the item in the list at the index, whatever index you give, and then replacing items. Okay. So it says, as we saw in the last lesson, you can get the number of items in an array list using its size method. The array list starts off empty with a size of 0. So if you create an empty array list, right? This is array list, string, list, and then we're just calling this list, and we find the size, it would print out 0. It says with arrays, a note, you use the length field to get the number of items in the array, but an array list is different. Remember, dot length for an array, and you would use size for an array list. Okay, common mistake. It says you will not be penalized if you mix them up on the CSA exam, but I mean, technically it's still wrong. Number of items in an empty array list is 0. Okay, so let's add things to this list. We already talked about how to add. It says run the code to see how the list changes as an object is added to the end. It says notice that we added the same string to the list more than once. Let's run it. Let's take a look at it. So I have public class list add 1. My main method, I create an empty array list, right, full of strings. I then add a name. This is called name list. I add a name. I add Diego. I then add Grace, and then add Diego again. So I've added 3 names. and it prints out Diego, Diego Grace, Diego Grace, Diego. And the last one, namelist.size, tells me there are 3 items, 3 elements in my list. It says, notice that we added the same string to the list more than once, and it can hold duplicate objects. So saying like, even if there's multiple Diegos, that's okay. Now it says, can you add your name and print it out? So I'll go ahead and do that. So I'll say namelist dot add, and I'm going to go ahead and add Mr. Danza. And then it wants us to print it out. So I'm going to be lazy, copy line 13, and go down here and print it out. Let's run it. Let's see if we're good to go. Oh, I guess maybe they want me to add the size to the end. So I'm just taking whatever I had in line 14, where it said nameless.size. I'm just adding it to the end. It wants me to add your name.
No, it's probably it doesn't want the Mr. lead in that. It passed for me.
Pass for you. So if I say Danza, you're telling me it will work? Alrighty. So these are issues I face on a daily basis, unfortunately. Mr. Danza would work too. Okay, but it just didn't like it. Whenever you hear me say things like that, where I'm like, I don't know what it wants, that's the reason why. Because it's not, obviously I added my name to the list. All right, there you go. When adding integer objects to the list, you can use you can use the integer constructor like add new integer 5 in Java 7, blah, 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 blah. Okay. Anyway, it says we already talked about auto boxing and unboxing. We're not going to talk more about that. We have an example here. It says array list is going to be full of integers, and we call it list, and then we have to say it's a new array list full of integers, which it makes it blank. Then we say, hey, look, it says, well, this will only work in Java 7. This will work in all Java versions. Cool. Doesn't matter. They're like trying to confuse you there for no reason. You can put any kind of objects into an array list, even instances of a class that you wrote. For example, here's an array list of students. Okay, an example of an array list for student objects. Add a new student. So we'll just run it first. Here's our main method. We have an empty array list called roster. And then we add Skylar. And then we add Ayana. And we're adding in, we said new student, right? And it adds in the record Skylar at sky.com, blah, blah, blah. If I run it, it prints these out, right? It prints them in a list, notice, right? This is my first element. This is my second. So it says here, add a new student with your name and info in it. So I'm going to go ahead and add another student. I'm going to copy line 10. And in line 11 here, roster.add new, I'll just say Josh, because who knows what it will say if I add Mr. Danza. Mr. Danza at gmail.com. And then my student ID would be, I'll just change the last digit to 3. You can change it to whatever you want, the 6-digit number. Let's run it, see what happens. Okay, notice it adds that third element to my array list. It goes from there. Okay, 723, it says the add. There are actually 2 different add methods. We dealt with add before above there, but what if we wanted to add an index and an object? The add object method adds the past object to the end of the list. If you add an index first, it says method adds the past object at the past index, but moves over any existing values to higher indices. Okay, so we take a look here. Let's follow this along here. We have a new array list called list1. We added 1 to the list. Then we added 2 to the list. Then in index 1, we added 3. So this really should now read 1, and then 3, and then 2. Then we added 4. So it should read now 1, 4, 3, 2. Run it. 1, 4, 3, 2. Okay, that's confusing with integers there that we're adding integers. It might be less confusing if we were dealing with strings and adding strings in there. Maybe they give an example with strings, right? But the first argument you pass in tells the computer, or tells the array list where you're putting it in at, right? And this is element 1. You're not replacing, you're just taking everything that was after that and pushing it to the right. Okay. Notice also I wanted to add that when you only add 1 argument, then it just adds that number to the array list. That's it. It says array lists, like arrays, start numbering their elements from 0. What will print when the following code executes? Okay, so get out my trusty pencil here. We add 1 to the list, then we add 2, then we add 3, and then it says add 2, 4. We're adding 4 to index where index 2 is. So 1, 2, 4, 3. Okay, then at the very end, we add 5. So it should read 1, 2, 4, 3, 5. And that is C. Okay, so this is an example of what you might face on the AP exam. What will print when the following code executes? Okay, so I have a list called list1. I added Anaya. I added Layla. I added Sherry. And then in index 1, I added Sarah. So that would push Layla to index 2 and Sherry to index 3. We then print the list out. Due to what I just wrote down, I wrote down Anaya, Sarah, Layla, and Sherry, which is the very first one. So it should be A. Seven two four, we're removing a certain element at the given index here. And it says when you remove it, you can also remove items from the array list. It removes and returns the item. It removes and returns the item at the given index. This will move all the other items over in the underlying array and decrease the size by 1. Okay. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. I have an array list called list1. I add 1, I add 2, I add 3, print out my list, and it should read 1, 2, 3. Then I will remove 1, and that will only give me 2 and 3. Okay, so we had 1, 2, 3. We removed what was at, I'm sorry, I said should give me 2 and 3. I'm not removing the number 1. I'm removing this index 1. Okay, important to note here. I said that wrong. We're removing whatever is inside that index. Okay, so remove that index. Gives me 1 and 3. Let's take a look here. It says what we'll print. I have an array list called list1. I've added 1, 2, 3. And reminder, it doesn't remove the 2. It removes what's at index 2. So we have 1, 2, and 3. We take out index 2, which is actually going to be 3. So what's left in my list? Just 1 and 2, which should be C. Okay. The get and set. Okay. You can get the object at an index using whatever the object is saying, whatever it's saying using whatever it's assigned, the name of the list dot get index. And you can also use set using a very, very similar method there. Both methods require that the index argument refer to an existing element of the list. Must be greater than or equal to 0 and less than the size of the list, okay? It says, notice that array lists use get and set methods inside of the index operator that we use with instead of the index operator that we use with arrays, and it says array index. So moving down here, it says try to guess before we run it what's going to happen. Let's look. I have my main method. I have my list called namelist, and I'm adding Diego. I'm adding Grace. Write this down. I have Diego. I have Grace, and I have Deja. Print it out, and it should return Diego, Grace, Deja. And then it says system.out.println. It says nameless.get0. So that should print out Diego. And then nameless.get1, which it should print out Grace. And then it says nameless.set1 to John. So index 1 was Grace. So we're replacing Grace right here with John. So it should read Diego, John, Deja. Let's see if we're right. Okay, so Diego, John, Deja. It says, next step, it says, can you get the last element in name list to print out? And also, can you set the first element in the list to your name and print it out? So we'll go through one at a time here. It says, can you get the last element in name list to print out? So we'll say system.out.println. And if we want the last, we would say namelist.get. And what we'll have to do is, remember before we were using the size up here. I think that was the very first one we talked about. So we had like nameless.size, and that gave you the exact number there. So I'll scroll down. So we'll say nameless.size -1. And I could simply just say get 2, but depending on the size of the list, I'll return a different number. Okay. And then from here, it says, can you set the first element in the list to your name? Okay, so we'll say namelist.set. The first element in the list would be 0. And it didn't like when I added a space there before, so I'm just going to do this. Set to your name. And then it wants me to print it out. So I'll copy this and print out that. Okay, let me just check on line 16, make sure that still looks good. I'm going to print out the last element. The way I did that, remember with an array, it was, dot length -1. Here you use dot size for array lists. Okay, and it worked. So we printed out the last two things we just did there. We printed out Deja, and then we replaced what was the 0 index, which was Diego, became Danza, and then John. It says, what will print when the following code executes? Okay, I have an empty array list called list1. We add 1 to it. We add 2. We add 3. Then we take whatever's in index 2, which is 3. I'm going to cross out 3, and I'm going to put 4 there. Then we add an element to index 2, which is going to be 5. So that's not going to replace it. The set replaced it. Add just adds another number in there. So my new list should read 1, 2, 5, 4. And then at the very end, we add 6. So what I just wrote down was 1, 2, 5, 4, 6. And that is C. So important to note that the dot set method is different from the dot add method. Okay, another example. You're going to see questions like this on the AP exam. That's why they continue to go through this with you. That one involved integers. Now let's go through with strings. It says I have Anaya. I have Layla, adding to my list. Sherry. I then want to set what was at index 1, which was Layla. I'm going to cross out Layla, and I'm going to add Destiny. And then it says add index 1, Sarah. So right in front of Destiny, I'm going to add Sarah because add is different from set. Then I printed out, I wrote down Anaya, Sarah, Destiny, Sherry, which is D. Anaya, Sarah, Destiny, Sherry. Let's go ahead and stop there so we don't get caught before the end of class here, and we'll pick back up at 726 next time.